My name is Zachary Deming. I'll be your chair for the third panel this afternoon, which is entitled Public Minds. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Julia Weingart, who's an associate professor in the Department of Polish, Russian, and Lithuanian Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the author of 2013's Wonderlands of the Avant-Garde, Technology and the Arts in Russia of the 1920s, which came out with Northwestern University Press, and Soft Matter, The Poetics of Weakness in Late Soviet Socialism, which is forthcoming in 2024, also with Northwestern. Her co-edited volumes include The Human Reimagined, Posthumanism in Russia, with Academic Studies Press in 2018, and Нестандарт, Забытие эксперименту в советской культуре, 1934 to 1964, published with NLO in 2021. She's currently working on a series of articles about the relationship between epidemiology and literature. The title of her talk today is The Logic of Autoimmunity in Anton Chekhov's Island Sakhalin.
Thanks so much. I probably should, okay. Can you hear me? Thank you, Lyra, so much for putting together this wonderful conference and inviting me. Okay, so I'm going to just begin. As Anton Chekhov was undertaking his trip to Sakhalin, the medical world was abuzz with new developments in microbiology and the emergence of immunology as a field of scientific inquiry. Louis Pasteur has already confirmed his germ theory of infectious diseases. Ilya Mechnikov has recently given his report on целебные силы организма, the critical role of phagocytosis in host defense at the First Union of Russian Natural Scientists and Doctors. And the year Chekhov makes his way to Sakhalin and back, which is 1890, Robert Koch announces prematurely in August of 1890 that he has discovered a vaccine therapy for tuberculosis out of the attenuated tubercular bacilli. The world rejoices, and with it rejoices Chekhov. In December of 1890, he writes to Suvorin, "I believe in Koch and in Spermin, and thank God. The public looks at all these Kochins, Spermins, and so forth as a miracle suddenly erupting from someone's head like some Afina Palada. But people close to the medical business see in all of this a natural result of everything that has been achieved in the last 20 years. With all this ferment about the nature and teleology of infectious diseases, the central debate in the rising science of immunology is really who's to blame. It is clear that microbes are to blame, but they're everywhere. And then why is there such a variation in their virulence? How does contagion happen? And when does it lead to morbidity and mortality? To what extent is it the host to blame for its lack of resistance to threatening foreign elements, or for its inadequate measures to attenuate microbes' virulence? And finally, what is the role of the environment? So these are the questions that Chekhov as a doctor is deeply and personally concerned with, and as a writer cannot help but translate into social contacts, relations, and contaminations. So this talk will trace the relationship between physiological and cultural contagion and the problem of immunity in Chekhov's Sakhalin Island, isolating illness-inducing bacilli to Sakhalin, attenuating their detrimental impact on the body of Russia. The penal colony is a form of building immunity against disease, making the communal body healthy. But Sakhalin is not only a penal colony, it is also a colonial project. Establishing a colony, introducing foreign elements into the body of the state, is a different form of immunity building, this time via inoculation, controlled adulteration by attenuated agents. Both projects are supposed to come together simultaneously. Chekhov, an ardent believer in scientific progress and positivism, even as he is going there, already knows that Sakhalin Island is a modern project that somehow went terribly wrong. In his letter to Suvorin, explaining his reasons for the trip, he writes, "We should make pilgrimages to Sakhalin to bow to it like the Turks go to Mecca. Sailors and prison wardens should approach Sakhalin like army men approach Sevastopol." The allusion to Sevastopol and Russia's shameful military defeat there is a clear indication of his method. One must study what went wrong with the project in order to correct one's own mistakes in the future. Chekhov wishes to subscribe to the teleology of the humanist thinking, in which reason invariably triumphs over the hostile environment, ordering and subjecting it to humankind's benevolent will. But just like Bruno Latour a century later, he identifies in Sakhalin the complex intersection of two central practices of modernity, one oriented towards purification, classification, order, and enclosure, and the other towards contamination, hybridity, and expansion. In the journal, Sakhalin Island, as a bipolitical development, is a result of two self-canceling forces. On the one hand, the island itself, its nature and mores, which reduce all difference to naught. On the other, the empire's civilizational impulse to regulate, differentiate, and hierarchize, echoed in Chekhov's own intellectual impulses. The journal stands witness to Chekhov's vision of the island as a hell on earth, that's what he calls it, pure chaos, which he desperately and not fully effectually attempts to systematize and order through his sociological method of fastidious demographic census taking. As we know, Chekhov hoped to present his journals in lieu of a dissertation to a medical department of Moscow University. I'm going to argue here that even though the project was not accepted by the deans of the medical school, Chekhov persuaded me of the medical merit of this work. So I'm going to argue that Chekhov not only examines Sakhalin as a bipolitical project, but arrives at a new way of thinking about communal immunity. He does it by at first identifying Sakhalin colony as a cure that is malfunctioning and turning itself into a disease, thereby arriving at the logic of autoimmunity. Autoimmune disease is when the immune system starts attacking one's health, the healthy cells of one's body. But from there on, he stumbles upon a way of thinking about the immunitary mechanisms in a way that would prevent them from going into overdrive and destroying both the presumed pathogens and the host organism itself. In his letter to Suvorin, he declares that he goes to Sakhalin to pay his debt to medicine. This repeated assertion has two incompatible implications. Does Chekhov go to Sakhalin because he associates it with medicine, with curing, and if so, from what? Or because he thinks of Sakhalin as a disease in need of a doctor? His sister Maria suggests that he has been reading about the horrible conditions of prisoners in Sakhalin in the press, and he wanted to go there to describe and remedy it in his narrative. So then, in this narrative then, Sakhalin is a disease in need of a doctor. However, several years before going to Sakhalin, in 1888, he writes a short obituary for the famous geographer and conquistador Przhevalsky, who was an ardent and outspoken defendant of European colonialism in Central Asia and Far East. In that obituary, Chekhov refers to Przhevalsky as a sun that shines and lights the way in our sick times, в наше больное время, and also as an antibody, a useful bacteria. Writing about a boy who reads about Przhevalsky's advancements into Far East and dreams of running away to Africa or America, Chekhov writes, quote, "These are weak symptoms of benign contagion which inevitably sprouts from heroism and spreads all over the world." So in this respect, Chekhov seems to be on board with colonialism, the spread of European influence as a force for good, a form of positive contagion. In his letter to Suvorin, explaining his desire to go to Sakhalin, he seems to be intrigued precisely by the incompatibility of the two above stated aims within one Sakhalin project. He calls it колонизация преступниками. So he goes to Sakhalin precisely because he's uncertain whether it is a disease or a cure. He wants to find out, and the journals themselves, however, continue to evince Chekhov's persistent uncertainty on this point. We find Chekhov struggling to make sense of how something ostensibly remedial can turn into its opposite. He explains the government's concessions that allow convicts less prison time with the incompatibility of incarceration and colonization. And here's a quote. "When punishment, in addition to its primary aims of vengeance, intimidation, or correction, is combined with other aims such as colonization, it should properly be adapted to the needs of the colony and yield to compromises. The prison is antagonistic to the colony. Their interests are completely opposed to one another. Life in prison wards enslaves and eventually degenerates the convict. The instincts of a settled householder, of good management, of family life, are stifled in him by habits acquired through a gregarious existence. Okay, so it follows from this explanation that Chekhov, from a rather pre-Foucauldian standpoint, sees incarceration primarily in terms of exclusion, and colonization by diametric contrast in terms of cultivation. Cultivation here also entails evolution, inclusion into the human community, understood as European or Russian, which cannot but be thwarted by the negative aspects of incarceration. And he writes, quote, that proximity will not Russify, but only completely corrupt the Gilaks, there is no need to prove. So Russification of the Gilaks, the indigenous population of the island, is thus to Chekhov and not necessarily negative aim. It is only the use of prisoners for it that he finds unsuitable. Vera Tolz in Russia's Own Orient writes about how at about the same time, a leader of Siberian regionalists and a champion of the rights of Siberia's indigenous population, Nikolai Yadrintsov, spoke very similarly about how he was proposing that increased immigration should be done by good quality Russian settlers, that it's very important that the settlers are of good quality, right? So the question, I guess, both that Yadrintsov and Chekhov shared is how can civilization's most diseased, impure elements be charged with bringing purification and enlightenment to the darker corners of the world? Chekhov's association of coming to Sakhalin with medicine may thus have to do with the conception of the island as a project for the improvement of human matter. For Chekhov, modern medicine must be a vital element of the general advancement that Russian settlement of Sakhalin should bring. Indeed, he concludes his ethnographic notes with a discussion of the state of medicine on the island, whether because this topic represents the culmination of all efforts to improve the life of the indigenous population, or because the state of medicine is so abysmal that getting some sense of it takes time. Long puzzling, moreover, is the conundrum he faces. Modern European, Russian science equals improvement, and yet the presence of Russians seem to make the indigenous population sicker rather than healthier. Chekhov is appalled by the unscientific approach to medicine he finds on the island, by the inadequate medical record keeping and overall lack of knowledge. I'm going to skip some things. So he also notes that there are like made up diagnoses. He calls it excessive suckling of the breast, lack of development towards lives, inflammation of the body. But in the same chapter, he himself indulges in fantasies as well, prompted most likely by his ideological position and positive belief in progress, which lead him also from reality to some wishful thinking. So, for example, he repeatedly makes the dubious claim, an especially strange one coming from a medical professional, that the local population appears to be immune to some infectious diseases. While his assertion regarding immunity to smallpox could be explained by the vaccination campaign that took place in 1859, he further claims that other infectious diseases somehow are not present on the island, seems suspect. Like, for example, he says scarlet fever and diphtheria so far have found unfavorable ground for their development on the island. So why is Chekhov so invested in the idea that the indigenous populations are impervious to infection from outside? So where records show large numbers of the local population succumbing to an infectious disease, for example, smallpox, then he uses a different tactic to exculpate the colonizers as suspected bringers of such contagion. He writes, in direct contradiction to his earlier statement about the immunity of local inhabitants, that the Gilaks indeed have weak resistance to epidemic. But for this, they have only themselves to blame, he said, basically, given their unhealthy, unhygienic circumstances detrimental to their health. So in Chekhov's description, the Gilaks' bodies are pungent melanges of person with environment. Chekhov conceptualizes them as lacking discrete borders, as contaminated by animal and foreign matter. He emphasizes their unwashed fleece, ensconced in furs and boots made of dog hides, permeated with the smell of dried and rotting fish, and penetrated by tiny maggots. Chekhov's description of the local population as an undifferentiated conglomeration of matter is part of the island's processes of hybridization. Crucially, in discussing the island's indigenous Gilaks and Ainu, Chekhov indeed contends that these populations are dying. He clearly struggles to explain the paradox by which the extinction of these populations coincides with a colonial intervention that was supposed to present them with the benefits of freedom and knowledge. In fact, Chekhov's scientifically dubious assertion that the indigenous inhabitants are impervious to some diseases, infectious diseases from beyond the island, goes hand in hand with his wishful minimization of Russian impact so far. And here's a quote. Undoubtedly, the number of Sakhalin Gilyaks is constantly decreasing, and this judgment can be made simply by eye count. How large is this decrease? Is it because Gilyaks are becoming extinct or because they're moving to the mainland or farther north of the island? It's possible that up to the present day, Russian influence has been insignificant, almost zero, since the Sakhalin Gilyaks live by preference along the Tim and the eastern shores of the island, which the Russian settlements have not yet reached. So similarly, Chekhov attempts to interpret the decreased numbers of Ainu, the indigenous population of the island's south, as a matter of resettlement rather than extinction. So he repeats the same thing. He says, before southern Sakhalin was occupied by the Russians, the Ainu were virtually Japanese serfs. It was so much the easier to subjugate them because they're meek and timid and because they were hungry and couldn't live without rice. Chekhov goes on to state that having freed the Ainu from the Japanese, the Russians are dedicated to protecting them from oppression, but the absence of the Japanese and their rice is having a deleterious effect. Unfortunately, says Chekhov, the Russians did not bring rice along with freedom. With the departure of the Japanese, nobody fished anymore, wages stopped, and the Ainu began to starve. So we are to understand that the presence of enlightened Russians was valuable for the indigenous population, despite the fact that the Russian conquest has thus resulted in the loss of a key food source. Chekhov faults the Ainu for failing to put the Russian-provided freedom and enlightenment to productive use. Those who didn't migrate from the island in search of sustenance now roam Sakhalin. Quote, they roam usually hatless, barefoot, their trouser legs pulled up above their knees, glancing at you cordially, mournfully, and sorrowfully, as though they were complete failures, and wanted to apologize for having full-grown beards while unable to scratch a living for themselves, end quote. When it's not the indigenous population themselves to blame for their lack of resistance, it's the environment or other contaminating agents. So, for example, he writes, nothing is known about the morbidity and mortality of the Gilyaks, but we can arrive at some conclusion based on such contributing factors as filthy living conditions, immoderate consumption of alcohol, long history of interaction with the Chinese and the Japanese. Syphilis came to our natives of the Amur region and the Kamchadals from the Chinese and the Japanese. It was not the fault of the Russians, says Chekhov. Matthew Mangold writes that Chekhov was drawn to those branches of medicine that strove to articulate relationship between health and material environments. Hygiene was obviously one of those branches. As Mangold says himself, however, the one problem with blaming disease on the environmental influence is the environment's extensive scope, right? The quote from Mangold, and the influence of environments is broad, anything from damp quarters to courses, from sex to coffee, tea, alcohol. In the Pasteurization of France, Latour argues that the boundaries of hygiene are vague, and this vagueness is precisely what allows its practitioners to express more or less everyone's interests. So the broad quality of the environment influence allows Chekhov to pivot from one agent and vector of disease to another, and in the process to somewhat extricate science as well as colonialism, spheres of positive influence, from the obviously detrimental effects on the population of the island. Do Chekhov's minimizations of Russian impacts on the indigenous population of the island stem from his subscription to the project of colonization as an Enlightenment project? Kathy Popkin argues that Chekhov's trip, undertaken under the premise of service to the cause of knowledge, resulted rather in an epistemological crisis. From the outset of his travel notes, Chekhov consistently interprets the island as not Russian but foreign. It is thus his mission to go and domesticate it, to make it known through categorization and ordering. Seeing results opposite to this aim and seeing them everywhere disconcerts him. The island seems to resist any attempt at order and to reduce all difference to naught. This undifferentiation was the most traumatic aspect of Chekhov's Sakhalin experience. Chekhov attempts to arrive at a definition of community as something more than a mere cohabitation and hybridization of disparate elements. In his view, community is cemented by the common aim of self-defense. It is something with differentiation and borders, but the island doesn't respect these. Chekhov laments that Sakhalin communal wards are amounting to neither a community nor an association. They're just a crowd exempt from any responsibility towards their living space. This exemption makes them animalistic. Just as the indigenous population, the prisoners appear to Chekhov as a kind of aggregate of living and non-living matter, human flesh, insects, rags, and he bemoans the victory of the animal over the human, calling the boiling, seething mass of bedbugs and lice the winning creatures. The multi-ethnic space of the island strikes him as likewise disturbingly disordered. The population's diversity and continuous movement rule out, in his view, the creation of a true community. This is just, again, a random conglomeration of matter, and he writes, in many settlements, the inhabitants do not give the impression of a village community, but of rabble brought together by chance. They call themselves brothers because they suffer together, but they have very little in common and are strangers to one another. They do not share the same faith, and they speak different languages. The old-timers despise this motley crew and ask disdainfully how there can possibly be a community if in the same settlement you find Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, Poles, Jews, Finns, Kyrgyz, Georgians, and Gypsies. So, yes, I'm gonna skip this. So, the epistemological crisis and the crisis of governance on the island lead to the inversion of development as traditionally understood. It is rather the Russians infected by the foreigners around them who degenerate. According to Sunderland, colonization-induced regression was a worry commonly expressed in policy reports and political discussions of late imperial Russia. Chekhov combines a left-of-center intelligentsia critique of the state's colonial policies, the idea that important peasants and prisoner groups will adversely affect the native population, with more retrograde perceptions of the local population's inhumanity and the potential harm to Russian settlers of proximity to multiple different ethnicities. The abysmal upshot is the encroachment of otherness on Chekhov himself. As Sarah Young observes, quote from Sarah Young, the failure to obtain knowledge is gradually replaced by a feeling that such efforts are pointless. And as this happens, the author, through his participation in social activities, ceases to be an outsider as the colony's ability to extinguish difference exerts itself on him as well, end quote. And yet it seems to me there is a positive outcome to all of this. It's precisely because Chekhov begins to see how difficult it is to differentiate between the self and the other. He starts understanding the problem with conceiving of immunity as purification, isolation, and expulsion. Right? He understands that these attempts at purification are futile and cannot but lead to the failure of recognition common in all autoimmune diseases. Of course, there were no autoimmune diseases at that point, right? They only appeared in the 1950s. But his logic, the way he's thinking about it, is he's already prefiguring that, I argue, right? Where the system kind of begins attacking the cells of one's own body. And he starts thinking about immunity differently. And I would like to argue that he starts thinking about how to think of, so there are various concepts of immunity, and before immunity became to be known, the concept of immunity as a defense against intruders, it was actually conceived as originally it signified a legal exemption, right? The law's delineation of exemptions to its own universal domain, thus protecting the community from the community's own self-debilitating excesses. And it seems to me that he starts thinking about immunity in those terms. He starts thinking about how to protect the precarious elements from his community's destructive tendencies rather than immunize the community against them. At one point, Chekhov goes on to say that bringing the benefits of Western medicine to the Gulags and others of the island's indigenous people might and should try to mitigate the negative effects of the non-native presence here, right? So he has, this is a sentence that I find to be very interesting. Quote, medicine cannot delay the fatal extinction, but perhaps doctors will be able to arrive at the conditions under which our intervention in the life of these people could bring them the least harm, end quote. So in moments like this, a sense of Russian inviolability or superiority gives way to a thought that one must think about how to relate to the other more responsibly, less harmfully. If he posits would think of it in terms of exemption rather than exclusion, as a form of kind of reining in one's own impositions, then we can start thinking about even like biopolitics, right? How biopolitics would promote immunity as a practice of inclusivity. And I'm using here Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito's thoughts about how to think about immunity differently. And I think Chekhov is moving in the started moving in Sakhalin Island in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Professor Kate I. Riley, who is a scholar of comparative literature and the theoretical humanities. Her research uses her training in Central and Eastern European literatures and languages to inform a study of comparative modernisms, the relationship between the psychologistical sciences and culture in a global frame, Cold War internationalism in the wake of decolonization, and globalization's impact on subject formation. Her first book, Psychic Empire, Literary Modernism and the Clinical State, is forthcoming with Columbia University Press in May of 2024. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Journal of Ecohumanism, Siege, Frontiers in Integrative Neuroscience, and College Literature, and for edited volumes via Fordham and Brill. Her talk today is entitled Mind Reading in Public, Plotting Psychopower Through Soviet Fiction and Mass Spectacle. Professor Riley, thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you to Valeria for organizing this and to everyone who's helped in its process. Thank you also to all of you who have spoken today. I feel as though I'm very lucky to have heard these talks and to be able to pick up on some of the themes in what has been said in my own presentation here. I'd like to briefly list what those are so that we can have them at the forefront of our minds. First, the description of the body politic in the anatomical and physical terms of flow, the relationship between psychoanalysis and historical materialism, a question about the place of rationalism between the 1860s and the 21st century, interest in sub-canonical works, a problem of the cue as a ritual of self-acknowledgement in the Soviet Union, some questions about Lenin's body therein, as well as a lot to do with biopolitics and Foucault. So I'm going to try to weave together some of those themes in what I have to say today. All right. So my talk is pulled from a selection of the material in my book. This is Psychic Empire, Literary Modernism, and the Clinical State. In preparing this talk, I had a dilemma for myself. I was unsure as to whether present close readings or the big theoretical claim that this book makes. In line with the conference's emphasis on the question of the relationship between science and the public sphere, I decided to go for the big theoretical claim. So this is somewhat at the expense of close readings, but I have a little bit of those more towards the end. All right. So the central claim of this presentation is relatively simple, though it will take me some time to justify and explain. The assertion I want to share with you today is as follows. Modernist texts from Central and Eastern Europe disclose the representational and linguistic aspects of fields long seen as psychoanalysis' objective alternatives, empirical psychology, psychiatry, and the neurosciences. My claim is that works of art created at the turn of the 20th century, works that have been long presented in secondary scholarship as reflections of more real scientific findings about the mind, whether through the Jamesian stream of consciousness or psychopathologies like schizophrenia, instead track the rise of a classificatory logic for mental life that developed in tandem with the formation of modern nation states and continues in the present. And in order to justify this assertion, I'd like to invite you to follow me on a journey across 4 propositions that will structure my remarks here. Proposition number 1, a major epistemological precondition for the formation of the modern mind sciences, psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and neuroanatomy in the 19th century was the possibility of representing the mind as if it were like the body. Doing so was important because it made the mind mathematically measurable for the first time, and in the same way as the rest of the physical world. Here's proposition number 2. Representing the mind as measurable in the 1850s and thereafter not only enabled the emergence of new scientific fields, but also altered the way in which contemporaneously emergent nation states measured and imagined their contingent populations. Put differently, the establishment of psychiatry, psychology, and the neurosciences as sciences, not domains of speculative philosophy as they had been for Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, changed the representational imaginary of public space as well as popular sovereignty as part of a broader project of quantification and statisticalization associated with, but not limited to, the rise of modern nation-state bureaucracies in Imperial Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Imperial Russia, and then in the Soviet Union. Here's number 3. Telling the story of non-psychoanalytic fields like psychiatry and psychology, how they altered the public sphere and impacted subject formation, is a task best done from within the humanities. This is quite different from reading the humanities objects as either fictive or affective narrativizations of more real facts produced by research in the mind sciences. Number 4, reading from the humanities to the sciences rather than vice versa shows that the non-psychoanalytic mind sciences have an unexpected debt to representation, language, and culture, all of which have been features associated almost exclusively with psychoanalysis. And in my time here today, I want to look with you very, very briefly at 2 quote-unquote subjective aspects of objective fields, psychiatric science and neurological research, by turning to Soviet novelist Vsevolod Ivanov and to the Russian playwright Nikolai Evrenov. All right. This is a slide of the contents of the book, just so that you can see I'm going to be focusing here on chapters 5 and 6 at the end of my remarks. I apologize that the font is somewhat smaller than I had intended on this slide, but thank you for bearing with me in that regard. Okay. As well, and I'm going to be beginning by elucidating some of the epigraphs that form the beginning of the book. The previous slide is too small to see what they are, so they're here in larger form. There is a point in Narratology, Introduction to the Theory of Narrative, at which Mika Ball pauses to reflect on the scope of her enterprise. In a comment made as an aside at the end of that work, and as part of a kind of apologia for her use of structural analysis rather than an ideological formulation to organize the book, she writes as follows. Quote, a consequence of the approach taken in this book is that a great deal of attention was given to classification. When dealing with determined relationships between classes of phenomena, the ordering principles that form the basis of these classes must be made explicit. Classification, however, is not a self-serving aim for the literary scholar. Its use is instrumental. Only when classification helps achieve greater insight into the phenomena constituting the classes is it meaningful in describing the text, unquote. Ball is here thinking of the relationship between ordering narratological terms and the study of narrative, between nomology, classification, and the exegesis of emplotment, if you like. Her comment folds back, however, origami-like, to become its own negative, a reflection on what an introduction to narratology is not. It is not, as she suggests, a form of automatic interpretation. Neither is it ready-made reading. Classification does not substitute for the study of the text itself, and hence it is not, quote, a self-serving aim for the literary scholar. The first edition of Ball's Narratology was published in 1985, but her comment harkens back to an observation that Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno make in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, published some 4 decades earlier. Horkheimer and Adorno remark, formal logic offered Enlightenment thinkers a schema for making the world calculable. The mythologizing equation of forms with numbers in Plato's last writings expresses the longing of all demythologizing number became Enlightenment's canon. The same equations govern bourgeois justice and commodity exchange. Bourgeois society is ruled by equivalence. It makes dissimilar things comparable by reducing them to abstract quantities. For Enlightenment, anything which cannot be resolved into numbers and ultimately one is illusion. Modern positivism consigns it to poetry, Dichtung. Poetry in the broad sense of Dichtung is here perspectively the catch-all for modern positivism's discards. In Adorno and Horkheimer's formulation, Dichtung is the dustbin into which all that cannot be assimilated into rationality and is unable to be integrated into number must be cast, awaiting return as myth. How strange, then, that schizophrenia, that preeminently narrative, willfully unclassifiable, and most literarily fecund of diseases, a disease which, for those reasons, has been closely associated with literary modernism, should appear in the 21st century in exactly the numerical, positivist, rationalist, and classificatory guise that Ball, Horkheimer, and Adorno had thrown out of the narrative realm in the 20th. Here is the definition of schizophrenia given by the 5th edition of the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published in 2013. The highlighting here is my own. Schizophrenia diagnostic criteria 295.90 F20.9. 2 or more of the following, each present for a significant period of time during a 1-month period or less if successfully treated. At least one of these must be 1, 2, or 3. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms. I won't read through all of them. My point is simply to bring out the emphasis on calculability within this claim. The book I've just completed, Psychic Empire, Literary Modernism, and the Clinical State, grew out of a deep confusion at this clash. On the one hand, there seemed to be a set of narratives, fictional as well as non-fictional, that presented themselves in terms of, or were being newly read in terms of, modern scientifically diagnosable mental diseases. These literary works, the category of the neuronovel would be one such example, and their associated reading strategies regularly spoke in the language of rights. DSM diagnostic language is a common feature of the medical humanities, trauma studies, narrative medicine, the neurohumanities, disability studies, auto theory, affect theory, the neurodiversity and neurodivergence movement, and cognitive literary and film criticism. On the other hand, there was a robust body of work on narrative, like Ball's and political philosophy on the left, that was no less embedded in the issues of rights, but that nevertheless suggested the fundamental inadmissibility of a classificatory ordering as a replacement for textual exegesis. Indeed, a body of work coming out of critical theory that characterized the reduction of reading to classification as essentially unethical. Moreover, while the diagnostic terms from the psychoanalytic lexicon had undergone intense scrutiny and criticism during the linguistic turn of the 20th century, those of the DSM and similar psychiatric manuals seemed to lack anything comparable, while nevertheless featuring prominently in descriptions of what literary objects and literary modernist objects in particular were doing. So the emergence of this style of reading in work like that of Oliver Sacks, which you may be familiar, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, is one such text, and new psychical identitory categories within the DSM, foreign to the psychoanalytic lexicon, motivated me to turn in my research from the question of psychoanalysis and its discontents within modernism, and to ask instead what it means to declare oneself schizoid, DSM-5, 295.90, F20.9, or autistic, DSM-5, 299.00, F84, in literature or in life, or indeed to be declared as such. And in that sense, Psychic Empire offers a new chapter on the debates in language, the mind, and modernist literature that have defined conversations in structuralist and post-structuralist scholarship, as well as in psychoanalytically informed literary studies. In my book, I turn to the critical and epistemological dimensions of the 19th century precursor to the contemporary psychiatric classification system, that is the DSM and also the ICD, developed by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, whose dates are 1856 through 1926 in Russian Dorpat, which informs the present system to offer what I talk about as an archaeology of psychopathological naming. So rather than beginning from a question of whether the unconscious is structured like a language, which would be Freud and Lacan, or the mind organized by a plastic neural biology that allows the brain to speak, this is Antonio Damasio, Catherine Malabou, Oliver Sacks, or indeed whether consciousness is organized by categorical laws determining the perception of reality, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, I am considering how the rise of a semantic regime of rigorously codified mental illnesses developed in diagnostic manuals like the DSM and the International Statistical Classification of Diseases, the ICD, now shapes globalized accounts of telling and selfhood in modernity. My conceit here is that modernist literature from the 19th and early 20th century offers a key perspective on this little explored iteration of the mad person's speech, so-called mad person's speech. The body of literary texts written in industrializing Central and Eastern Europe around the turn of the 19th century were conceived of in the same time and in the same region that the modern account of psychopathological classification was born. Whereas modernist literary and dramatic works have long been read as representing or being influenced by the findings of then newly emergent disciplines like empirical psychology and clinical psychiatry, or treated as narrative reflections of these fields' accounts of mental functioning, Jamesian stream of consciousness, interior monologue, Bakhtinian double-voiced discourse. I'm proposing that modernist aesthetic works could equally well be considered as fraught negotiations of this newly scientized understanding of the psyche. In the book, I'm looking specifically at authors including, from the Russian and German language canon, including Georg Buchner, Nikolai Evrenov, Vsevolod Ivanov, Daniel Paul Schreber, and Ernst Toller, to argue that they navigate the dilemma of psychopathological naming as it was created and applied to populations in this region at a moment at which nation states were massively bureaucratizing. Such naming, I think, holds out the possibility for liberating the subject by legitimating mental experience and guaranteeing associated rights, but also carries the risk, and we see this, I think, in Julia's presentation, of pathologizing, racializing, and gendering the subject, thereby retracting rights in the name of objectivity. So the book is tracking then the complexities arising for the contemporaneous consolidation of modern nation states in standardized psychopathological categories in the late 19th century, and doing so by thinking about the question of how these categories framed the popular mass as a rights-bearing people at a moment following the French Revolutionary transition from royal sovereignty to popular sovereignty. Western political philosophy has long understood the idea of a people as being synonymous with being compos mentis, sufficiently capable of mündigkeit, of maturity within Immanuel Kant's terms. And so for this reason, the notion of popular sovereignty and popular sanity tend to go hand in hand. So my position here is then that the operation of standardizing definitions of mental health and illness was interwoven with the project of imagining and representing on the level of both Darstellung and Vertretung, the people as bearers of sovereignty in the wake of the French Revolution. Now, there's been a lot of work that's been done by figures such as T.J. Clark and Eric Santner to argue that sovereignty's political theological dilemmas appear within modernist representation on the level of the body and dilemmas about how to literally figure the body within modernist works. I'm not going to talk about those here in the interests of time, but what I want to suggest is that the body was not the only place of representational contestation at which the dilemmas of popular sovereignty were worked out, that it was also the place of the mind, and that the problem of how to represent a people in the post-revolutionary period is figured as much in terms of a Foucauldian biopolitics and dilemmas surrounding the body as a psychopolitics, which I'll describe for you in the next portion of this paper, that within modernist literary works was a site of radical contestation, that is, how to figure the psyche so as to make it the mind of the people. Why is this not Foucauldian biopolitics, or what am I saying about this in relationship to Foucauldian biopolitics? Well, here's a little brief primer on what Michel Foucault says about biopolitics so you can see how psychopolitics fits into the mix. Foucault introduces biopolitics in the first volume of The History of Sexuality in 1976. There he defines it as that which, quote, brings life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations and made knowledge, power, an agent of transformation of human life. His related concept of biopower, biopouvoir, undergirds biopolitics. It comprises both a disciplinary anatomical politics of the human body, focused on the optimization of individual bodies, which dates to the 17th century, and a much more modern turn to the population's species body, the corps espèce, where it was once possible to describe sovereignty in terms of, quote, the ancient right to take life or let live, faire mourir ou de laisser vivre, symbolized by the sword. In modernity, one speaks rather, Foucault says, of, quote, a power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death, faire vivre ou de rejeter dans la mort. In place of targeting individuals, power now operates on the level of the population. The task is no longer one of wielding the deductive, life-negating power of the sword, but of the affirmation and management of life accomplished through the knowledge power of calculability. The 18th century genesis of demography, as for example in the work of Jean-Baptiste Mouot, analyses of the circulation of wealth like Quesnay's Tableau économique, and studies of the relationship between resources and inhabitants on display in Prussian Johann Peter Süssmith's Die göttliche Ordnung, all speak to a form of population control sustained by and through mass measurement. Quote, the old power of death that symbolized sovereign power was carefully supplanted by the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life, Foucault writes. As life enters history, moreover, the law ceases to be a site of strictly juridical power, but one in which the power of the norm increasingly holds sway. The law, without changing its appearance or shifting from the traditional institutions of justice, operates covertly more and more as a norm that works to exert regulatory control on alleged abnormality. In the 19th century, however, the mind also went through the process of becoming calculable. Empirical psychology and clinical psychiatry, as they were developed in Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Imperial Russia, were explicit in their presupposition that the mind was anatomizable, divisible, and measurable in exactly the same way as the body. This is a radical departure from the way in which transcendental philosophy had framed the mental life up until the 1830s. In the sixth and final of his meditations, Méditation, René Descartes makes his case for mind-body dualism on the grounds that the body is divisible, but the mind is not. Quote, there is a vast difference between the mind and the body in respect that the body, from its nature, is always divisible and the mind is entirely indivisible. 100 years after Descartes, the soul's indivisibility remained the case for Immanuel Kant. His Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science from 1786, published just before the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason was released in 1787, reasserts the soul's inseparability. Based on this claim, Kant states that psychology cannot be grouped among the sciences at all. And what I want to emphasize here in this long quote is that Kant says there are two reasons you can't ever have a scientific psychology. First, because mathematics is not applicable to the phenomena of inner sense. And second, because the manifold of inner observation can be separated only by mere division in thought and cannot be held separate and recombined at will. So essentially, you aren't going to be able to meaningfully divide up thought into units. This is also the case for Hegel, who prohibits the localization of the mind directly in the brain on the grounds that it is specious to analogize between Geist and the physical world and the phenomenology of spirit. By the 1860s, however, the picture had changed very dramatically. German psychophysicist Gustav Theodor Fechner's The Elements of Psychophysics, published in 1860, proposed that the relationship between mind and body could indeed be understood in terms of precise invariable laws. As Fechner defined it, psychophysics was, quote, an exact theory of the relationship between the body and the mind, unquote. Like physics, psychophysics would be based on, quote, the experience and mathematical connection of empirical facts about body and mind. Now, Fechner's goal was to produce a specifically mathematical understanding of the psyche. And he claims that in a flash of insight, he says, rival to Descartes before the heated stove, he had a revelation in 1850 about how the mind-body could be expressed in exact mathematical terms. This is the controversial solution at which he arrived, known as the Fechner-Weber law. I'm not going to take you through each part of this equation, but in the synopsis of Wilhelm Wundt, essentially this logarithm says that sensation increases in proportion to the logarithm of the stimulus. Sensation increases in proportion to the logarithm of the stimulus. So if I can experience a sensational perceptual difference that can be correlated with something in the external physical world, I can correlate between mind and body, is in other words what Fechner said. Wilhelm Wundt's empirical psychology is based on taking the Fechner-Weber law as a premise that consciousness can be measured in this way. So too is Emile Kraepelin's clinical psychiatry. So I think following this, what one could do is speak about the advent of a psychopower and a psychopolitics alongside a biopower and a biopolitics in the 19th and 20th century. Unlike biopower, psychopower involves the invention of the species mind, an esprit espèce, based on the transcendental mind's entry into calculability in the mid-19th century. Anatomizing and dividing the mind similarly enabled both the management of the population's mental health and the optimization of the population's species mind. Sovereignty was now expressible both as a biopolitical, quote, power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death, and a distinct but related psychopolitical power to make sane, to foster mental health or to disallow it to the point of expulsion from legal and philosophical personhood, understood in the form of Kantian Mündigkeit. So in the interest of time, I just want to skip to summaries of what I do in chapters 5 and 6 of the book with these modernist literary texts, one by Vsevolod Ivanov and the other one by Nikolai Evrenov. Is in the opening chapter of the book, I introduced the concept of psychopower through a reading of Georg Buchner's Wojciech. Subsequent chapters unfold different aspects of a psychopolitical paradigm by readings of different literary works. So in chapter 5, I'm particularly interested how the very little known Soviet novelist Vsevolod Ivanov, most familiar for his text Armored Train 1469, in this lesser known text simply titled "Oo," actually makes a case for psychiatry as having a value form in a manner that is analogous to what Marx talks about in Das Kapital. And I've slightly scrambled my pages here, so forgive me a minute. Okay, so we are, okay, in chapter 5 of the book, I'm focusing on psychopower's economic implications by investigating the fate of Kraepelinian psychiatry in the Soviet Union. This chapter attends to the question of non-Freudian economies. There I engage with Vsevolod Ivanov's untranslated novel, "Oo," written during 1929-1933 and posthumously published in 1987. Composed as the Soviet Union was in the process of banning psychoanalysis and shifting its scientific focus to neurology and behaviorism, Ivanov's novel takes a surprisingly critical stance on the economic implications of Kraepelinian psychiatry, not Freudian psychoanalysis, as one would expect. Against a growing Soviet critique of psychoanalysis as bourgeois and individualistic, Oo frames Kraepelinian clinical psychiatry as actually more capitalist than Freud's work. The novel subtly suggests that Kraepelin's classification generated a psychical version of the value form that replaced the Freudian economy of desire with a mental model structurally mirroring capitalist economic exchange. Chapter 6 follows the complexities of a naturalized model of the mind further into the Soviet context by turning to psychopower's key role in representing the Soviet people as a people in the tumultuous years following the Russian Revolution. There I show that Russian playwright Nikolai Evrenov's monodrama, Kulisar Dushi from 1912, which engaged with theories from psychophysics and empirical psychology, was the basis for a Soviet mass spectacle that consolidated a picture of the Soviet popular will pivotal to the Bolsheviks' narrative about the Russian Revolution. Strikingly, Evrenov's bourgeois slapstick monodrama about psychical dilemmas, the psychical dilemmas of a married man in love with a cabaret singer, and there's a connection here to melodrama, which we were just talking about, nevertheless became the foundation for a giant public spectacle aimed at a sense of fostering a collective psychical solidarity and public unity in a moment of factional strife in the consolidation of a Bolshevik narrative about 1917. There is something to be said here about the fate of Lenin's brain as well within this narrative, and Lenin's brain as a site for psychopolitical representation of the popular sovereignty. But I will leave that to the Q&A if anyone is interested, so that we can get to all of your wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Two splendid papers. And now I will pass the little microphone apparatus to our discussant. Anne Lounsbury is a professor of Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. She's published widely on 19th century Russian prose, as well as on African American and European literatures. Her most recent monograph is 2019's Life is Elsewhere, Symbolic Geography in the Russian Novel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone right? Got it? Okay. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This is really fascinating. It's a wonderful, wonderful conference. Both of these papers examine problems associated with quantification. They actually reminded me of an anecdote I remember hearing from Ron Suney a few years ago. Suney said that at a conference, he once heard a non-Foucault influenced political scientist ask a Foucault influenced political scientist, but how would you measure that? And the Foucault influenced political scientist responded, what, you only like to count, you don't like to think? So I think that this panel addresses precisely the intersection of counting and thinking, and that's a topic that could not be more timely, given that we live in the age of big data. I'm going to address the papers separately, hoping that the ways they speak to each other will be evident, and I apologize for addressing Weingut's paper at somewhat greater length because I received the other one later. So Yulia's paper is The Logic of Autoimmunity in Chekhov-Sakharin. Fascinating reading of Sakharin. I see it as extending and complementing what Kathy Popkin describes in her article on Sakharin as Chekhov's confrontation with epistemological failure in the face of the prison colony's horrors. And as I remember Popkin's analysis, it's principally about how Chekhov's text falls apart, devolving by the end into these lists of numbers, tables, charts that cannot explain anything. And I also remember, just as an aside, years ago when the article came out, I encountered strenuous objections to her reading of Sakharin from senior scholars who could not tolerate the thought that the master had somehow lost control of his text. They needed to see Chekhov's narrative as being redeemed by some kind of intentionality or coherence, but as Popkin's analysis shows, that is really not the case. I think that Weingut starts where Popkin left off, in a sense. That is, she looks into the causes of this epistemological failure several steps back and linking these causes to his awareness of new developments in microbiology and immunology. And as Yulia explains, Chekhov's views were basically scientific positivist and pro-imperial. His was a worldview that really needed to believe in the ultimate healthiness of Russian colonial intervention. And Chekhov seems to have implicitly assumed that his own medical and scientific views would be supported by what he was going to find in Sakharin. But then what happened instead was that these views were undermined. Because Sakharin was, as Weingut writes, not only a penal colony, but also a colonial project. It was meant to both isolate prisoners and introduce indigenous peoples to the benefits of civilization. So in Bruno Latour's terms, it was both a purification project and a hybridization project. When seen in medical terms, the Sakharin prison combines two incompatible aims. Weingut writes, one oriented toward purification, that is classification, order, and enclosure, the other toward contamination, hybridity, and expansion. So the question arises, as you ask, is Sakharin a cure or is it a disease? And this is the conundrum that Weingut argues can help explain Chekhov's epistemological difficulties, because clearly his own records reveal, in spite of themselves, the population of Sakharin was getting not healthier but sicker as Russian state settlement was advancing. Weingut argues that this contradiction, though, is intellectually productive in a sense, in that it pushes Chekhov toward an idea akin to what we would call the logic of autoimmunity, that is a cure that's malfunctioning and turning into a disease. One question I have that's only kind of tangentially related to that is, why for Chekhov is undifferentiated matter so bad, right? I mean, we know that, as Mary Douglas writes, dirt is matter out of place, and we know that bad hygiene is a way of blaming Native people for their own disease and death. But I'm still struck by Chekhov's kind of intense loathing of and his preoccupation with the Native peoples and the prisoners' failure to preserve boundaries between the self and the not self. And here I was actually reminded of a Liskov povest called Na kraju svetu, at the edge of the world, in which the Russian narrator, who's an archpriest and a colonizer in Siberia, he's obsessed with the natives' filth and stench in almost exactly the same vocabulary as Chekhov uses. And I'm just very interested in this idea of what you call an undifferentiated conglomeration of matter. And then Weingut concludes with reference to Roberto Esposito on the idea of immunity. And Esposito proposes that in thinking about immunity, tell me if I have this right, we turn away from the idea of purification, instead turning back to the idea of exemption, which is the meaning we see in the terms legal uses, as in immune from prosecution. if you have more time, I'm sure you could unpack Esposito's work. I think the proposal is an excellent one because rarely has the idea of purity, whether hygienic, ideological, sectarian, ethnic, sexual, theological, whatever, rarely has purity been anything but an excuse for people to oppress and kill other people. We humans are born into history and language and culture, and all of these are utterly impure from the very beginning. And now I'll turn to Kate Riley's paper, which was fascinating. Riley gives us an overview of her new book, Mind Reading in Public, Plotting Psychopower Through Soviet Fiction and Mass Spectacle, the article of which I understand to be as follows. When the mind came to be imagined as something measurable. Previously, she argues, mental life had been conceived in some kind of, this is my vocabulary, holistic term, Geist, esprit, terms that resisted quantification, division, and measurement. And this shift toward quantification was linked to the rise of the modern nation state and its bureaucracies, which relied on technologies of measurement in attempts to imagine their populations. And here we think of Benedict Anderson's Census Map Museum. Riley traces the implications of this development up to our own time in phenomena such as the DSM-5, which allows one to classify mental illnesses by counting symptoms and coming up with labels, like, for example, autistic, which is DSM-5 299.00 bracket F84.0. And I've had students who can tell me the numbers of their own DSM categorization, which I would add is further reinforced by insurance companies, right? So there's this sort of giant self-reinforcing system that kind of reifies these categories. And as I understand it, the book's concern will not be how these ideas influence literary works, but rather, quote, how modernist aesthetics could be considered as fraught negotiations of a newly scientized understanding of the psyche. And I'd like to hear more about that, little clarification of what this fraught negotiation means. It's a prospect that strikes me as very interesting. I look forward to hearing more. And then there were just two interesting passages that I want to point to in the paper. The first is in Mika Ball, where you talk about, she's basically diagnosing her own mania for classification, right? And it reminded me of being assigned in graduate school, Gerard Genet's book. I think it's called, no, I think it's the other one. Narrative Discourse. And I obsessively highlighted every single Greek term and made charts of them. And I still have the book. And I think there's something like deeply comforting about classification, pleasurable about classification. And I was a little worried that it wasn't true, right? That he wasn't really capturing everything, even though the words were in Greek. But I was like drawn to it over and over. And I think there's something really powerful about that. I don't know if that's good or bad. Okay, I'll stop there and let other people talk, but thank you so much. I really learned a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay, so the question why, I think I can answer that question.
Okay, good.
So I think from reading Chekhov through the prism of medicine, it's clear to me that the way he's thinking is very much influenced by the kind of medicine he's been studying. And he has been studying with his mentor was Theodor Erisman, who was a hygienist and a social hygienist. And so hygiene is a very, very important factor for him. And so this kind of undifferentiated matter, it goes precisely against, right, this idea of let's clean things from all these microbes that are coming at us from everywhere. Yes, so I think that would be the answer. In terms of Esposito, it's a very good question. How Esposito is thinking about Esposito is thinking about immunity as exemption. One of the examples that he offers is not a kind of immunity, the communal immunity that thinks of itself as brotherhood, because when you are brothers, you exclude whoever is not your brother, but a kind of a relationship that a mother has towards a child when the mother shares whatever mechanisms of immune system, right? Whatever immunities it has, it passes it on to the child, but then it also lets the child go. So the kind of non-imposition of oneself on the other when letting the other be is kind of a mechanism of immunity mechanism that Esposito is thinking about. But if we have to think about it from, like, if I had to right now figure out an answer to what it would be like, right? We could think about, for example, so Esposito is thinking what would be, we need a good positive biopolitics, right? Because we've been, after Foucault, right, with Agamben coming in, we have been very down on biopolitics. And then, of course, you know, the pandemic happened and we understood that we actually do want to be protected. Right, so we actually need those like vaccines and stuff. So, right, so, and then Agamben, of course, started coming out against, right, against all the, because, you know, because he reads biopolitics as this kind of, as this negative thing. Meanwhile, we still want to be protected, right? So I'm thinking Esposito's idea of positive biopolitics would include, for example, something like us staying at home, trying to not infect another human being, right? So that would be precisely the kind of exemption where we exempt the other from our own infection, right? So that would be the kind of positive biopolitical mechanism that, yeah, that we could, and we did exercise.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful.
Thank you so much for your questions. And so I'll try to take these in order. Why here? What's the fraught relationship within literary objects? And then about the pleasures of classification. So why here? Well, you know, one of the things that happens in the 19th century is that the Center for Psychiatric Research shifts from France, where it had been in the 17th and 18th century with figures like Pinel and then Charcot, with whom Freud trained, into Germany. And Leipzig in particular becomes a really central hub in Leipzig University for psychiatric research. This is where Wilhelm Wundt establishes his the first laboratory for empirical psychology. Emil Kraepelin is a student of Wundt and works with him for his doctoral degree before going off to Russian Dorpat and setting up one of the first modern psychiatric clinics within the Russian Empire at Dorpat. And so it's the Germans, and if you look at even work by, I'm thinking here of Eric Engstrom's Clinical Psychiatry in Imperial Germany is the name of the book. Germany and Austro-Hungary become the new centers for psychiatric research. And what we think about is the precursors to the contemporary practice of clinical psychiatry and empirical psychology in their non-psychoanalytic form. That's important because, and this is also very little told history that I try to deal with in the book, what people within the United States tend not to recognize is that up until DSM-3, which is published in 1980, the dominant model for psychiatric treatment is psychoanalytic. DSM-3 is conceived by researchers at the Washington University in St. Louis, explicitly in opposition to the psychoanalytic model. They say that psychoanalysis has no data. And so there needs to be an empirical model for understanding mental life, which is why there's an important connection between what happens with Kraepelinian psychiatry in saying, oh, look, we can measure the mind, and DSM psychiatry after 1980, and to all of our students identifying themselves in terms of these numerical labels. So what I'm trying to do is offer a kind of a literary epistemology of DSM classification as it unfolds from the discoveries, quote unquote discoveries here, that are made within an imperial German and Austro-Hungarian context in a post-1860s period. And the story has really been told in part because psychoanalysis has had such a dominant place historically through France. And so I'm working to sort of think about how one might tell the story through Germany and in an idiom that's different from the one that the history of science has used. What is the fraught nature of negotiation within literary objects? I'm so grateful to Julia for, I feel like, this presentation that has also helped me think about this. When you're talking about immunitas with Esposito and Foucault, two sides of the same coin, I see the same dilemma unfolding in the psychopolitical iteration of biopolitics. That on the one hand, you have psychopolitics as the possibility of managing the mental health of the population. On the other hand, you have the problem that in the wake of the French Revolution, you also have to find a way to imagine and to represent the moi of la volonté générale, or what Rousseau calls la volonté générale, the general will, right? And it's important that it is a self, that Rousseau says it is a moi, that there has to be some way to conceive of the collective self. So I think what happens with psychopolitics is that it's always caught between this moment of the management, kind of Foucauldian knowledge power management of the mental health of the population, and the necessity in a context of popular sovereignty of being able to imagine the moi of the volonté générale at all. You have to have a way to conceive of the psyche politic. And so there is an autoimmune dimension within psychopolitics, where you could talk about it in terms of the pharmacon, if one wants to use that language. And I think what's interesting for me in reading these literary works is that they're not just saying, oh, poo-poo, this is a bad psychopolitical phenomenon in one way or another. They're wrestling with this problem, that the constitution of a psychical self on the level of the collective also comes with the possibility of racializing, gendering, and controlling the population in terms that present themselves as value neutral psychically. And I see this as the dilemma of students saying, speaking as a fill in the blank psychically. It's not always, or it's a complicated dance within the discourse of rights, and one that I think is too seldom discussed, especially when it gets linked back up to discourses about the brain, and the way in which the DSM is now correlated with knowledge about, thinking about what happens within the human brain. On the pleasures of classification, I don't remember exactly where Sigmund Freud says this, but he has a line. He says, neurosis is discomfort with ambivalence. I think that some of, not wanting to say psychoanalyze Gerard Jeanette or Arthur Fry for that matter, but I think it is comforting, actually, and I think it is pleasurable to have an answer. Or to take another angle on this, it's less psychoanalytic. Walter Benjamin has a piece about detective fiction, in which he says, why was the Kriminalroman so popular in the Weimar Republic? Well, it's because it offered the possibility that there was the great sleuth who would hold out the solution at a moment of political time when it seemed there was so much that was insoluble. And so I think it's interesting that in the context of the 1980s in particular, there should be a turn to the classification of mental life. Perhaps that is itself a response to an anxiety about certain insolubilities within the political sphere. I think that there's certainly a connection where we go between psychopower and psychopolitics and anxieties about Trump's mental health, and why that became such a popular discourse. But I will simply leave it there.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for excellent remarks. I see.
There's Marina.
For questions. Please.
Thank you for the wonderful panel. I have questions for both presenters. And first for Julia. this is really very interesting reading of Chekhov. And my question is about the nature of the epistemological crisis and something that Anne described as his pro-imperial predisposition. So basically he comes to Sakhalin, and this is his encounter with imperial diversity. And he is going there expecting to find disorder and then, fix this disorder so the order will emerge. And what he finds is that empire is basically a rational order, right? So there is no order to this disorder. And then it looks as if his diagnosis or your diagnosis of autoimmune disease should be addressed to empire. So basically this is empire that is affected by this autoimmune disease, and it's asystemic diversity is a problem, and the list that you read of all these diverse types among the prisoners, plus Gilaks and Ainu. So they are diverse not only because they are different, they are also different in civilizational sense. So these are different types, speaking of typologies, and so empire is basically thick. And then the question becomes how pro-imperial is he, whether this is epistemological crisis that is connected with the absence of any alternative to this disorderly, sick autoimmune, with autoimmune disease empire. So basically, what is your kind of answer to this? And my question for Kate is kind of maybe naive, right? So speaking about the region and how it was important in the history of psychiatry, and especially like non-psychoanalytical theories of mind. Where do you place Bechterev and the entire school? Because of course Kaplan was very important, but it was reinterpreted and reincorporated in the Russian imperial context via Bechterev and Military Medical Academy School of Psychiatry. So and then Bechterev, of course, was very influential in like larger cultural context in terms of generating like literary responses, right? So where is he in this story? Thank you.
Wow, I need to think about how to answer the question. I think, first of all, I think what happened was that when he was going to Sakhalin, he already understood that there is going to be some kind of a problem, but he was only thinking about the prisoners. He was only thinking about the problem, at least from what I read, right? There were never any issues with him thinking like, oh, we're gonna get there and there will be all these people and they're going to be like microbes. Instead, he's thinking there is some kind of a wound. Sakhalin is some kind of a wound that has been isolated, but something in this wound is not working, and he's only thinking about prisoners. Then I think he actually finds himself surprised from reading, because it's a very long, journal. And I think he finds himself surprised when he suddenly starts talking about the indigenous population and trying to explain, and then he tries to explain how the methods, scientific methods, right, and the imperial methods, how these methods that are supposed to actually be beneficial for the indigenous populations, in fact, turned out to be not. And so he's looking for various, at first he's looking for various excuses, right? He's trying to figure out, so maybe it's not the Russians, maybe it's not the influence, and maybe it's the environment, and maybe it's the island itself. I also haven't read to you all these things that he's thinking about the actual island, how the island has something like the weather of the island, right? He also starts talking about how something in the nature of the island that causes this kind of disintegration. But then he comes to this kind of idea that maybe there is some kind of a problem with power. And that's what I find interesting, right? That he suddenly thinks that maybe the way we're using power, and not specifically towards the prisoners, he already knows, even as he's going there, that treatment towards prisoners is going to be wrong, that that's wrong, that what they're doing with prisoners is wrong. But now he's also thinking maybe the way we are relating with the indigenous population is wrong. And that's where it becomes interesting to me, right? That sudden intellectual move that he's making there, that I think is interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for the question about Bichterev. You know, in formulating this project, I really wrestled with the issue of whether to do this through kind of lines of influence between Germany and Russia, or whether to do it another way. And I ultimately abandoned the lines of influence model because the book I could already see was going to be very large. And if I followed lines of influence, I was not going to be able to tell more of this problem of a structural and epistemological question. And I also was going to have far, far too many chapters. So Bichterev was one of the figures who I had the hardest time deciding to include or not include. But when I shifted to, let's say, a literary epistemology rather than a lines of influence model, it fell out of the picture, and I'll explain why. Because I wanted to abstract in this project from talking about any kind of an ontological claim about what mental life really was, and instead talk about the ways in which accounts of mental life had been formulated. And what was important to me was to be able to say that there was a time in the middle of the 19th century in which the mind began to be spoke about as if it were just like the body. And that is an as if. Now, I don't feel that it's my place to say whether the mind really is the body. It's not my place to resolve mind-body dualism. It's not my place, I feel, even to comment on it, right? But what I can do is read the narrative and historical strategies that sustain that as a technique of imagination. And so I see that, and first, I don't see anyone doing that. So that was important to me for that reason. But also, I see Bichtere's work as falling within the scope of a group of thinkers who began to conceive the mind as if it were in the framework of the body. And so Soviet neurology, and some of the story I wanted to tell about Soviet neurology is one that's very different from the story that, for example, Oliver Sacks tells about Alexander Luria when he writes in An Anthropologist on Mars and the man who mistook his wife for a hat. The story that Sacks tells is that Alexander Luria's work, especially on and his narrative writings about wounded soldiers within World War II, soldiers who had brain lesions, then came back and struggled with various different types of cognitive capacities, becomes the basis for a new type of neurological storytelling. I wanted to be able to say that Luria, you can look at it that way, but Luria comes out of a tradition which is often venerated within contemporary neuroscience of Soviet neurology. But this neglects the ways in which Soviet neurology was itself indebted to a narrative framework, one that imagined, through this representational equation, that mental life could be made to be described in the same terms as physical life. And the example I would give here of a really brilliant case study in the ways in which the modern neurosciences neglect this problem of representation is a line that Antonio Damasio gives in his very famous work, Descartes' Error. He says that what was Descartes' error? It was to imagine, this is not a good exact quotation, I can't do it exactly, but Descartes' error was to imagine that the mind was not fundamentally divisible. It was to imagine that the mind was an ethereal, psychical stuff which couldn't be split into measurable parts. Now, that's a perspectival statement. It comes without recognition of there being a history of a transition into a moment at which the mind could be described as measurable, could be described as physical. And so there's an aspect of Damasio's error in the reading of Descartes' error as well. And I think that the position of Bechterev is to fall into a broader project of this very bizarre representational strategy of the psychical as physical. And I want to be clear in stating that I'm not making a case for the mind being exclusively psychical or exclusively physical. I'm simply paying attention to how accounts of it function. So thank you.
Since we began a little late, perhaps no one has questions. If we move with great alacrity, please.
Thanks for these wonderful papers. This is just two follow-ups for Kate, just two things I want to understand a little bit better about what you said. One of them is the difference. You just said the mind as physical and the mind as measurable. And I'm really curious about what's the measurable doing? Because I feel familiar with the story, which for me sort of starts with Sechenov, actually, of the mind becoming physical, right? But I think you're telling a different story about the mind being measurable. So I would like to know a little bit more about the math part and what that's adding to your project. And then also, and I think this is an extension of one of Anne's questions, the modernism part. I know you said this was a more large scale rather than close reading oriented paper, but I guess I wonder not just why literature actually, why you need literature for this project, but also why do you need minor literature? And forgive me for saying minor, but that you're sort of gravitating, right, towards lesser known modernist works. And I'm really curious about why.
And now, oh yeah, we'll see. Sure. Yeah, I also have two really quick comments, questions to Julia. For Julia, question is, it's an really interesting and promising project. I was just thinking about an intriguing parallel and differences between Chekhov's project and Tolstoy's interest in immunization, in зараженное семейство, infection, and his theory of infection, because that's how far away Chekhov is from Tolstoy, but also they belong to the same period and share the same challenges or problems. And also a question for Kate, and congratulations on your book. I'm looking forward to reading it. In the end of your presentation, you referred to what is called "За кулисами души." Yes, yes. I saw only. I never actually knew. I knew nothing about this book, but even the very first page, which you showed on in your PowerPoint presentation slide, suggests that it was affected by Vladimir Khlebnikov's experimental play Mrs. Lenin, in which he actually tries to measure the brain, and the protagonist, as you know, of course, of the story is a patient of mental assignment treated by Dr. Laws, mysterious name, and this is flood of consciousness, which is a subject for spectral analysis or integral analysis. So he employs mathematics or mathematical way to deal with the working of human mind. So I was just very much interested in the linkage between this early modernist or Khlebnikov's play. I don't remember, it's 1909 or 1910. I don't remember the date, and its echoes in the Soviet tradition.
Well, if there's nobody else, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts. I am from Sakhalin. I have spent most of my life in Sakhalin. Perhaps I'm the only one in this room, but I am a journalist also. I'm a journalist with Media Zona, which is the Russian publication that is covering criminal justice system and penal colonies. And so it's a lot of intersections here going on. But I've also been living in Moscow just next to the Lenin's Institute. So that's a lot of connections. Just wanted to briefly note that when I was a student, when I was growing up, there was a lot of Chekhov's book, and his the legacy of the book is something that is really important to Sakhalin's cultural space, but in general, it felt like the only thing that defined the whole cultural space. And there's the museum of the book, museum of the book of the Ostrov Sakhalin, which is what the public life is supposed to be revolving around. And it felt so in a way colonial, even for us Russians who have been born in Sakhalin, who are now natives of the island. It felt such a mistreatment and such a colonial thinking of a white conquistador who comes and sees us and see the forefathers of our generation. So it is quite an important. It is important to think about it, and thank you for the project, and thank you for trying to analyze this in a much more detailed manner. I also wanted to bring up Vladimir Sorokin, who was mentioned earlier, and his Meteor, the Blizzard, and other works that continue Chekhov's obviously line of work, but also recontextualize it in a much more poignant way. I believe it's one of his better works. So that's something that to keep in mind. Thank you.
Let's see if I can do this quickly. Chloe, thank you for the questions. First, physical, and then the relationship between the physical and measurement. So there's a lot to explain in this project because a lot of the arguments that I make are counterintuitive. But some of the genealogy of psychopower that I'm tracing is first the coming of the mind into the realm of the physical, the as if it were physical, as a basis for the making of the mind into a measurable entity. Because you can really only measure that which can be divided into little pieces. And unless mental life then has a quality of the physical, it can't be measured. And unless it can be measured, it can't be a science, right? It can't be like physics, because physics is all about the physical world. So the precondition to measurement is the imagination, the representational imagination of the mind as something that's physical and so divisible. And the literary source that I would give here actually is Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, which is a spoof of the possibility of dividing melancholy, which thinks in great detail about the relationship between the physicality of melancholy and its relative measurability. So that would be the answer there. Why literature? The book has what I hope is a very robust answer to this question. In the introduction, I defend a case for what I'm calling counterdisciplinarity as an alternative to either multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. And it seems to me that interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity take for granted the possibility of the humanities and the sciences coming to work on the same epistemological framework, or in the same epistemological terms. But I think what's actually very generative is to recognize that the history of the formation of the disciplines in the course of the 19th century division of philosophy into separate departments has produced a scenario in which there are two completing types of truth claims. One which is held by the sciences, which is based in empiricism and measurement, and another which is held by the humanities that is actually the opposite of that. So the counterdisciplinary model suggests that the relationship between the sciences and the humanities is one that doesn't need to presuppose the same epistemological moves on either side, and that they can be in tension with one another, such that the humanities offer a perspective on things the sciences cannot grasp because of their different formulation, and the sciences offer a perspective on the things the humanities cannot grasp. We can see more about the sciences if we read them through the humanities. It doesn't have to be a unilateral move of scientific facts explain what literary works do. So to turn to literature is to turn to those epistemological blind spots within the sciences that they are structurally precluded from having access to. Why, let us say, minor in quotation marks here, modernist literary works? Because I didn't set out to choose minor works. It was in a question as I was looking for places in which psychopolitical paradigms expressed themselves, I happened to find them in unexpected locations. And I actually started with a dissertation that took a look at Chekhov's Ostrov Sakhalin, and that was part of the project. And it had to fall out again in the interests of a certain number of chapters, and publishers saying that the book couldn't be 500 pages. But the case studies that I found were most effective did not come from major literary works, but I think in a kind of a longer conversation, it would be really interesting to talk about, say, Chekhov's debt to psychiatric censuses that were being conducted in the Russian Empire,
for sure.
and the relationship to the census taking that he did on Sakhalin. Yeah. And so I don't think that this is a psychopolitical discussion is any way limited to minor works. It's just that the case studies happen to be most effective with ones that were outside the so-called big name canon.
And if we may, I think we might be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments and questions. And interesting that you said that. My more developed part of this project is actually on the conversation between Tolstoy and Chekhov on the subject of immunization. And I connected actually to women emancipation because it appears, for some reason, Tolstoy's skepticism about microbiology appears in the same tract with his skepticism about women's emancipation. And then from there on, by reading all the fabulously digitized journals from 1886, I realized that there was this whole huge, long discussion that was going on where people were very upset with Tolstoy, and specifically were connecting in the responses to Tolstoy these two issues. And then Chekhov writes a story called Хорошие люди, excellent people, where a woman doctor decides she tries to figure out practical application of Tolstoy's nonviolence to evil, nonviolent resistance to evil, and decides that vaccination is that. And so she goes and she starts vaccinating. And so I already actually promised this as an article, but yeah, so this is a much more developed project, but that's exactly what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the conversation between Tolstoy and Chekhov on this subject. And thank you so much. That's fantastic to know that there's a person from Sakhalin here. And interestingly, this part of the project, the one on me writing on Chekhov's Ostrov Sakhalin, came from an article that I was writing on Sorokin's Metel and Verkin's Ostrov Sakhalin. I don't know, have you read that one?
I know about it.
So yeah, so I was interested again in the kind of issues of contamination in contemporary rewritings of Russian classics. And so that's when I decided, okay, well, since I'm writing on Sorokin and on Verkin, I should probably read Chekhov's Silent Sakhalin. And then what happened is that in this article that I was writing, 10 pages were dedicated to Chekhov. So my reviewers were like, what are you doing? You have to remove it. You were supposed to write about Sorokin and Verkin. So now I've decided that this is going to be a separate project. But yes, I was also thinking about Sorokin and Metel, specifically Metel in the context of Chekhov's Ostrov Sakhalin. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, all three of you, very much. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking all of our panelists today, and as well as Dr. Mutz for organizing such a superb show.